The Chicago Bulls did not end because greatness faded. They ended because, at some point, preserving institutional control mattered more than preserving the continuity of greatness. Most dynasties end when they stop working. This one ended while the machine still worked. So this is not a story about decline, and it is not a story about who destroyed the Bulls. It is a story about what happens when greatness becomes a governance problem. Once that happens, excellence changes status. It stops being only an asset. It becomes something the institution needs to contain. We have to begin with the machine that made greatness repeatable. The Bulls were not a hot streak, not a collection of stars. They were a machine built to reproduce greatness. Talent can win once. A machine can return. And dynasties are built on return. They were not defined by a single peak, not even by Michael Jordan at full force, but by their ability to bring that force back into winning form, again and again, under pressure. They had a structure capable of carrying Jordan's intensity. They turned excellence into repetition. They turned pressure into structure. They turned individual force into something the system could carry. And once greatness starts repeating, it stops looking like brilliance alone. It starts looking like design. The more a system depends on a precise structure, the less replaceable that structure becomes. They became a machine strong enough to turn a figure like Jordan into recurrence. And when power begins to live in an arrangement, it does not remain entirely in the institution that owns it. That is the hidden cost of repeatable greatness. When greatness returns often enough, it stops looking exceptional. It starts looking necessary. And once it starts looking necessary, power begins to move. Because repeatable greatness does not only win, it rearranges where legitimacy lives. Formally, the institution still owns the system, but real legitimacy begins to concentrate somewhere else. It gathers around the arrangement that keeps producing the result. And in this case, that shift becomes visible through the figure everyone can feel at the center, Michael Jordan. Not just as a star, but as the clearest face of what the institution now depends on to remain extraordinary. What looks like dominance from the outside begins to create dependency at the center. The institution still holds formal control, but part of its real power now lives in what it depends on to stay extraordinary. And once that happens, continuity stops being only a competitive advantage. It becomes an institutional risk. That is when the logic begins to split. From the outside, continuity still looks obvious. If the machine still works, you keep it running. If greatness still returns, you preserve the structure that makes it return. That is the competitive logic. But institutions also live by governability, because to preserve the dynasty was no longer just to preserve excellence. It was to preserve the dependency. And preserving that dependency meant accepting that the institution's highest performance now relied on an arrangement it could not fully dominate without damaging the thing that made it extraordinary. The issue was what the institution had to accept in order to keep winning. And once continuity begins to limit the freedom of the center, it stops looking like stability. It starts looking like exposure. The institution is no longer facing a competitive question. It is facing a governance question. How much greatness can a system preserve before preserving it threatens the institution's control over itself? And that is when the institution stops asking how to preserve the highest level. It starts asking what matters more than preserving it. The question is no longer how to keep greatness alive. It is how to recover command. The institution is no longer optimizing for excellence. It is optimizing for control, for governability. Once those become the priorities, continuity is no longer the goal. It becomes the thing the institution is willing to interrupt. So the choice is no longer between greatness and decline. It is between preserving greatness and recovering command. And when those two stop aligning, institutions do not always protect greatness. They protect themselves. The institution chose to preserve its authority even at the cost of breaking the continuity of what made it exceptional. It chose governability over greatness in motion, control over continuity, the center over the structure that kept producing the result. And once that choice is made, the ending is no longer a collapse, it becomes a consequence. And once that becomes the choice, the conflict changes form. It is no longer a tension between preferences. It is a collision between requirements. The dynasty could only survive if the structure that sustained it remained intact. But the institution could only recover full command by proving that no structure could stand above its authority. One needed continuity, the other needed interruption. One protected the arrangement, the other reasserted the center. And once those become the terms, the ending is no longer waiting for failure. It is already built into the structure. The same machine that kept greatness alive was now the machine the institution needed to break in order to recover unquestioned control. The problem was not whether the Bulls could still win. The problem was that winning and reasserting command no longer belonged to the same logic. The dynasty could continue. The institution could recover full authority. It could not fully preserve both. And when continuity and command stop fitting inside the same structure, the system does not drift toward an ending. It is pushed toward one. That is how the pressure is resolved, not by preserving both sides, by deciding which one survives the break. The dynasty ends, the institution remains, but it remains more governable and less extraordinary. The institution preserves itself as a machine of control by interrupting itself as a machine of excellence. It protects the logic that allows the center to remain the center. Nothing here requires greatness to fail first. Not Jordan's greatness. Not the system's capacity to keep carrying that greatness back to the top. The system becomes smaller not because it had to stop winning, but because shrinking it becomes the price of recovering command. So, this is not the story of greatness failing. It is the story of an institution that chose to become more governable than great. The result is not chaos. It is order at a lower level. A system still intact as authority, no longer intact as excellence. And that is why this was never only about the Bulls. What ended here was not just a dynasty. It was the continuity of greatness at the moment greatness became harder to govern than to preserve. That is the pattern. Institutions do not always break greatness because greatness fails. Sometimes they break it because greatness begins to reorganize where legitimacy lives, how authority is felt, and what the center can still control. And once that happens, the question changes everywhere. Not, how do we keep greatness alive? But, how much of it can we preserve without losing command? In companies, in teams, in studios, in institutions, in every system where excellence depends on an arrangement, the center cannot fully dominate without damaging the thing that made it exceptional. That is why the Bulls matter. Not because they were unique, but because they made the structure visible. A dynasty ended, but the mechanism did not. It is older than the case, larger than the case, and still with us. The pattern is always there.